Welcome back. I'm Professor Liam Malloy, and we are continuing Chapter 1 in our discussion for industrial organization. In this chapter, we're going to focus a little bit more on the tools that we're going to use and a little bit of the history of sort of antitrust policy in the United States. There are similar laws in the European Union. You could even argue that the European Union is a bit stronger in their antitrust laws and sort of application of those laws than is the United States, especially these days. But we'll focus on the United States. That's what I know a little bit more about, but the resources are out there for other geographic areas. So first thing we want to sort of think about are the tools that we are going to use. And one of the main tools we will use is game theory. So game theory is all about strategic interaction between players. So we'll have, a full chapter introducing game theory, and then we'll use game theory a lot because what industrial organization is about is usually the sort of pricing and quantity and advertising and product differentiation decisions in a market with, a few firms, whether that's 2 firms, 4 firms, 10 firms. They will have similar sort of strategic interactions. So game theory is very useful. I introduce it, in my Principles of Microeconomics course, definitely used in, intermediate microeconomics, but in a lot of areas. And so we'll talk a lot about the Nash equilibrium, right? And the Nash equilibrium, whenever we say Nash equilibrium, just think that it's the mutual best response, right? It's my best response to what you're doing and your best response to what I'm doing. It is not necessarily the best response in terms of, total profit or consumer welfare, but it is a mutual best response. And if we want to get to a different outcome, we're going to have to change the rules of the game a little bit. And so sometimes public policy is just about making those adjustments so that we can change those outcomes to get away from a Nash equilibrium that we don't like to a Nash equilibrium that we do like. Because if we don't change the sort of payoffs or rules, then no firm has an incentive to deviate away from that. The other main tool that we're going to think about, which is a little bit newer, is behavioral economics. And so a lot of microeconomics, starting especially in the sort of late 19th century, was all about rationality. And one of the reasons for that is that when firms and consumers and government are completely rational players, it allows us to solve for an equilibrium much more easily. When we introduce some level of irrationality, then coming up with a sort of tractable solution, some actual answer, can be much more difficult. But starting in the 1970s, psychologists like Kahneman and Tversky began showing us that people do not behave rationally, and we've seen a lot of evidence for that on the consumer side, and some evidence for that on the business side. So whether we're talking about loss aversion, where people value losses more than they do gains, status quo bias, where people just sort of stick with what they have, the affect heuristic, which is about how people feel when they're making these decisions, the availability heuristic, which is about, what comes to mind when people are making decisions. All of these are things that impact consumer decision making, and that firms can in some ways take advantage of to get consumers to make less than fully rational decisions. And if it's profitable for firms to do that, in the absence of any regulation, then we will have a less than desirable outcome. So one obvious sort of quick example is products that are addictive, right? Whether we're talking about alcohol or cigarettes or something else. And so one of the things that we have done in the United States and in other countries as well is to limit the advertising for those products, on the understanding that, that will, increase the availability of these things. It can increase bad outcomes. And so we don't want to do that. So we'll talk about behavioral economics, and the problem, of course, with behavioral economics is that it often introduces a lack of tractability, a lack of a clear answer, but not always. And we'll talk about different options we can use when discussing behavioral economics and industrial organization. So then we want to come to sort of public policy and think about, well, what are the goals of public policy, right? We sort of tried, you could say we tried capitalism without, too many rules in the 19th century, a more sort of pure laissez-faire capitalism, and we ended up with poisonous products and child labor and all sorts of bad things. And so we want some regulation, but we also know that we don't want too much regulation because that can stifle innovation, reduce competition, and we end up with bad outcomes there too. So, one thing, we might want to regulate a specific firm, especially if they have monopoly or near monopoly power. In the case of utilities, often what happens is it's a privately owned company, but prices are set by some sort of regulatory board. Antitrust policy, on the other hand, is really more about increasing competition in any given field, right? So we want to make sure there are enough firms. We want to make sure that they are not colluding. We want to make sure, that they don't control, too much of a market through mergers and acquisitions. And so, in the heyday of sort of antitrust policy, the United States has broken up things like, Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, AT&T, and now, of course, our companies with a lot of market power have market power for different reasons. Often it's network effects, whether we're talking about, Apple and the blue and green bubbles, or we're talking about Google ad search or Amazon and retail. And so I think, one thing that we want to think about as we go through this course is, are the laws that we have on the books appropriate for applying antitrust policy in a sort of more digital world, a world where network effects are the main, network effects and in some case superstar effects are the main sort of drivers of anti-competition. So we'll talk about, all of the various potential policies that seem to work, policies that don't seem to work. Generally, what economists try to avoid are policies that try to pick specific winners, right? So policies that support either a particular product or a particular firm rather than, an industry in general. And so we'll talk about that as well, especially, as we think more about industrial policy these days. So just to give a brief historical overview, the Sherman Antitrust Act was the first sort of anti-monopoly legislation that was passed in the United States in 1890. So two main sections. Section 1 says every contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce among several states or with foreign nations is declared to be illegal. So whenever you see trust back then, think monopoly, right? Anything that sort of reduces competition. A trust could be sort of an organization of companies, or it could be sort of one company. And then section 2, every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize or combine or conspire with any person, other person, or persons to monopolize any part of the trade or commerce shall be deemed guilty of a felony. So basically it says anything you try to do to reduce competition is, and to monopolize that industry is illegal. Now, you could certainly argue that almost everything that firms do is trying to increase their market power. And so obviously it's a gray area, right? When Apple comes out with a new iPhone with some killer new feature, they're trying to, monopolize that market. But at the same time, that's something we want them to do, right? And then we have to balance, all right, do we give them a patent for that, says to Samsung and Google and anybody else, okay, you can't use that innovation, or do we not, and hope that they sort of adopt those innovations in the future? So that's an open question and something we want to think about. The Clayton Act was 24 years later, so in 1914. Price discrimination is illegal. So price discrimination basically means I'm charging different prices to different types of customers in order to increase my profits. So you can't do that. We'll talk a little bit about price discrimination. Market restrictions such as exclusive dealing contracts. So, you can only buy from me. I can only sell to you. Those are illegal. Mergers are illegal where the effect may be to substantially lessen competition or tend to create a monopoly. So this is a big question, right? Do we want 5 airlines in the United States? Do we want 8 airlines in the United States? Do we want 3 airlines? It's not clear what's the right number, especially in an industry with huge fixed costs. So that's an interesting question. And then interlocking directories of corporations are prohibited. So, Pepsi and Coke and whoever else can't have like boards of directors that are made up of the same people, because then that will reduce competition. There's an interesting question in economics now of, sort of these large institutional investors like pension funds or hedge funds. If they own a lot of different companies in the same industry, does that reduce competition as well? Then we had the creation of the Federal Trade Commission. And it's an interesting thing about in sort of enforcement in the United States, where the FTC and the Department of Justice, or DOJ, kind of split up industries about who they're going to go after. And sort of historically, we've had, different more active DOJs or more active FTCs and vice versa. So, that's another thing to think about. And then we had this Hart-Scott-Rodino Act of 1976, which required firms of a minimum size to notify either the DOJ or FTC or both of their intention to merge. So basically, if you're a big company and you're going to merge with another big company, you can't do it secretly, right? You have to tell them. So I guess then the question is, well, what do we want the goals of public policy to be, especially around competition? So we'll talk about efficiency. That's kind of a standard economic goal, right? We don't want, whenever I think of efficiency, I think we don't want wasted resources, right? We want to be using our resources efficiently as possible. We'll talk about the difference between static efficiency and dynamic efficiency. Macroeconomic stability is good, although I think you could argue, whether or not it is the purview of competition policy and industrial organization. And then equity. So we certainly talk a lot about equity. I wouldn't say our policy necessarily tends to focus too much on equity, but sometimes it does. And so we'll think about that as well. So I think, one of the things that we always want to think about in economics is the fact that we are a social science as opposed to a natural science. This is a nice quote from a theoretical physicist. So we'll just read this quickly. Public policy is more complicated than clean and controlled scientific experiments. But considering the large and serious issues we face in the economy, in the environment, in our health and well-being, it's our responsibility to push reason as far as we can. Far from being isolating, a rational scientific way of thinking could be unifying. Evaluating alternative strategies, reading data when available about the relative effectiveness of various policies, and understanding uncertainties, all features of the scientific method, can help us find the right way forward. So now in economics, we're becoming more and more empirical as more and more data becomes available. And we've done a lot of work, good work, I think, on sort of natural experiments and trying to tease out causality versus correlation. And so I think we want to, think about that, but then also think about, which results are we more confident in than other results, and what data could we use in order to prove or disprove one of the theories that we're going to talk about in IO. So this is just a quick picture of sort of the changing nature of the U.S. economy just from 1982 to 2022, so over the last 40 years. You can see agriculture, forestry, and fisheries has declined by more than half. The big sort of increase has been in things like finance and insurance services. Manufacturing is about half the size it was in 1982. So we want to think when we're discussing IO that we're not only thinking about manufacturing, which is the sort of traditional industry that industrial organization talked about, but also how it applies to things like financial services, insurance services, real estate, and whether or not there are differences, right? So, if you think about music distribution, right? Music distribution is an area where the marginal cost of providing one more copy of the latest Taylor Swift song is basically zero. So how does that affect the model? And also, what's the effect of something like Spotify that, in some ways can really increase competition, right, by providing a platform for more and more artists. Um, but at the same time, superstar artists like Taylor Swift, like Beyonce, like whoever, have much more reach. So we'll talk about all of those things as well. So the last video for chapter 1 will be a um, math review. So if you are comfortable with the math review, you can skip that. If you're not so comfortable, we'll talk about that. We'll talk a little bit of calculus, a little bit of sort of profit maximization, especially with a linear demand curve. So hopefully that will be useful as well.